So again, my name is Ted Carlson. I'm with the City of Bellingham Public Works Department. And for those of you that don't know, Public Works is the city department that is responsible for planning, designing, constructing, and maintaining our city's transportation network. We also run the city's city-owned utilities, so the water utility, the sewer utility, surface and stormwater. And we have a natural resources division that works on habitat and environmental restoration and other water resource type programs, including protection of lake waterfront. But I'm here today to talk about transportation, and as was mentioned, it's part of a larger conversation that's happening around transportation, land use, and I don't know how many of you sat in on Charles's discussion just prior to this, but he talked a lot about some of the principles from his organization, Strong Towns, and how cities can look to,
one of our microphones seems to not be working. I think it'll be the one in your right pocket.
So Charles talked a lot about what cities and jurisdictions can do and how they can think about land use and land use management, really putting it into a financial context in a lot of ways, and how we can design communities that can be financially sustainable. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use land use planning and transportation planning and how we try to integrate the two. So it's a little bit more technical than what Charles was talking about. It's what's happening in Bellingham right now and how we're trying to utilize transportation goals and policies to support that type of land use development. So one of the things that we do is we update our city comprehensive plan. The City of Bellingham plans under growth management. The Growth Management Act was passed by the Washington State Legislature back in 1990, really in response to very rapid population growth. In jurisdictions all throughout the state, we're seeing growth out into the unincorporated areas. The cities were sprawling, creating some of the suburban sprawl that Charles was talking about earlier. There's a lot of different aspects to growth management. There's several different elements, but what I want to focus on today is the land use and the transportation aspect. When we talk about land use, as part of growth management and the comprehensive plan, we have to look out over the 20-year planning horizon. So right now, we're going through the process of updating the city comp plan. We're using the 2036 year as our planning horizon. And as part of that, we need to make sure that we have enough land supply within the City of Bellingham, within our current city limits, and within the area called the urban growth area, which is the land just outside of our city limits, but land that's intended in the long term to be developed to an urban standard and ultimately annexed into the City of Bellingham. We need to make sure we have sufficient land to accommodate both the growth that we talk about over the 20-year horizon, not just from a residential perspective, but also the industrial and commercial land that will create the jobs or allow the jobs to be created to support that growth. On the transportation side, transportation is the only portion of growth management where there's a requirement to adopt a level of service. As a city, we need to say, we're going to accommodate this land use and the growth. We're going to maintain a certain level of service from our transportation network that's serving that growth. We need to come up with a way to measure that. We need to make sure that those improvements in the transportation system, whatever they are, happen concurrently with the growth. It has to make sure that we maintain whatever that adopted level service is. And I'll talk more about concurrency and level of service here in a bit. So as part of the growth management process, the county, Whatcom County, they identify how much growth the county is going to accommodate over the 20-year period. And then they work with all the jurisdictions within the county, like the City of Bellingham and the small cities, and identify how much growth we need to plan for. So through the year 2036, we need to be planning to accommodate 31,000 new people and 22,000 new jobs. The first part of going through that process, and this is a map of the City of Bellingham, you can see the dark line on the outer, that's the existing city limits. And the land, like right here, just outside the dark line, that's the urban growth area. So that's not currently in the city limits, but we expect that at some point it will be annexed into the city. So we go through a land capacity analysis looking at the vacant land, and on this map, the shaded properties in purple are land that's either vacant or underdeveloped. It's partially developed, but not developed to the ultimate density allowed by the zoning. And we went through that analysis and said that if we look out over the 20-year period, we have adequate land. The city doesn't need to expand our urban growth boundaries. We should be able to accommodate that 20-year growth within our existing boundaries and within the UGA. So that's one of the first decisions that our elected officials need to make is, do we have enough land supply, and is it zoned appropriately to accommodate this growth? Into consideration all the environmental constraints. Much of that land has wetlands or steep slopes, wouldn't be able to be developed fully, and we wouldn't want it to be developed fully, so we take that into consideration. But you can see that most of that purple property is on the periphery of the city. And that's an area of the city, or certainly within the UGA, where we don't have existing infrastructure, at least not adequate infrastructure to support the growth. We don't have arterial streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, and in many cases we don't even have water or sewer utilities to support the growth. So what the city would like to do and what our land use goals say is that we want to see as much of that growth happen within the city center, within our commercial cores as possible. We don't want to have the growth along the periphery. We want to take advantage of the existing infrastructure, what's already in place, and maximize that and have a more compact form of development. So we've identified urban villages or city center areas within the city limits. We've also identified arterial corridors that have high frequency transit. And we recognize that high frequency transit is key to the transportation system and key to accommodating the growth that we want to see. So this is just a map of those urban villages. You can see that most of them are in the city center, the waterfront, the downtown, the old town. And then these are the high frequency GO lines, the transit that we use. We want to see develop occur along those transit routes and within the urban villages. The transportation side of that, we need to make sure that our transportation goals are linked very closely with land use, because the transportation network is crucial to ensuring that the development can occur the way we want to. We also want to obviously limit the urban sprawl, but to do that, we need to make sure that people can get around within the city center, within the denser, more developed portion of the city, that they can get around using all of the modes. Not just vehicles, but we want to make sure that we have built sidewalks and bike lanes and that the transit can move people efficiently. Ultimately, what we're hoping to see happen is that when we look at the various modes that people use to get around town, we reduce the dependency on the single occupancy vehicles or the SOVs, and people take different modes. It's a way of freeing up capacity and maximizing the infrastructure that we have so that we don't have to widen, we don't have to improve. Those are very costly, very expensive, and it's not a long-term strategy that's going to help us as we try to meet our growth demands. The last one is one that Charles spoke about in the presentation that I went to earlier today, and it's probably the biggest challenge that jurisdictions like ours face, is the ability to maintain the existing assets that we already have. We have hundreds of miles of arterials, we have hundreds of miles of sidewalks. It's very challenging to get the funding to replace those assets, and we look at our transportation assets along with our utilities. They're the city's largest assets, and we should be planning for replacing of those assets on a schedule that doesn't make them go beyond their design life cycle. So we've had very consistent policy. We're very fortunate in the City of Bellingham that the leadership, that our elected officials have been very progressive with the policy. And if we go back to what is our current comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2006, and we look at what we're proposing to be adopted now in 2016, the goals and the policies are very similar. We've been planning for these things for 10 years now. But even when you have clear and consistent policy language and policy direction, oftentimes it's the implementation of the policy that is much more challenging. Now we're talking about building projects, implementing programs that have a direct impact on people's property, whether it's a financial impact or some other type of impact. It can sometimes be met with resistance. So we need to have some implementation strategies that help us get where we want to go. So these are our four main implementation strategies when we look out over the next 10 or 20 years. I talked about concurrency. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. But the traditional method of measuring level of service doesn't support the goals that we're trying to achieve, and I'll talk about that in just a second. We recognize that not all of our builders and developers want to build in the city center. There's challenges to doing that. At times it could be more costly. And so we have developed some incentives. And incentives can be viewed both ways. There's challenges with providing developer incentives, but we believe that there is some need for incentives to get the development to occur where we'd like to see it happen. As I mentioned before, we need to make sure we have complete connected networks. It's not good enough to build sidewalk in certain sections of the city. We have to have that connectivity. People truly need to be able to move between neighborhoods using the various modes. And anytime we're trying to implement change, education and encouragement is key. And we need to work on that as we move forward. So concurrency. In its simplest sense, what concurrency says is that the transportation infrastructure needs to be in place at the time the development occurs. And the intention is that we're trying to link our land use plans with our transportation plans, with our capital improvement plans, the actual projects that improve the transportation network. Trying to make sure that those are all linked together. GMA doesn't tell us how to measure the level of service. It recognizes that all the jurisdictions are different. All jurisdictions have their own priorities, and we should be able to come up with a way of measuring the level of service of our transportation system that works best for the city of Bellingham. Well, what's happened traditionally is just about every jurisdiction has used the same method to measure the level of service. And that method is a very simple method of a demand versus capacity. So an engineer looks at a certain segment of street, an arterial section, whether it's a 2-lane, 3-lane, or 4-lane section. And we know that theoretically we can move a certain number of vehicles on those number of lanes. So we calculate that as the maximum capacity for that segment of street. And then we go out and we look at what's actually occurring during the busiest time of the day on that segment of street, how many cars are actually using it. And we have to use the busiest hour, and when that's generally your PM peak, it's the evening commute. So we go out and we do an analysis, we count how many vehicles are within that segment of street, and we do a volume over capacity analysis. And if you're only using, if you're using about 50 or 60% of your capacity, you essentially have free flowing traffic. You're not stuck in rush hour, you're not in gridlock, vehicles are flowing freely. And we give that a level of service, we assign that a letter grade of A. At the other end of the spectrum, if you have more cars trying to use that segment of street than it can accommodate, you're over 100% capacity, and we say that's a level of service F. Most jurisdictions adopt the level of service E as their standard. City of Bellingham adopted that as our standard in 2006. This is a bit of a complicated graph, or busy I should say. It's not really complicated, but there's a lot going on here. But we found that it's one of the more effective ways to really go through what concurrency is and how it applies to new development coming into the city. So on the vertical axis, we have the capacity of the street that we're talking about. And you can see that at the 50 or 60, there's a level of service A up to F at 100% and beyond. On the horizontal axis, that's the time of day. So it's representing an entire day. And what you see here is the volume. This is the traffic volume, the purple line. And the lighter purple underneath is essentially the used capacity of the arterial system. That's what's actually being used at any given time. And you can see that for most of the day, there's a tremendous amount of capacity. To widen or to improve an arterial section, when you already have this much capacity throughout 23 hours of the day, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But when we look at the PM peak hour, you can see that in this scenario, we're right at the level of service E. And the way a typical development proposal would work is a developer would come to the city with some proposal to build a building that would have a certain type of uses, retail, commercial, residential. And each one of those uses, we assign a number of PM peak trips. We look at it, we look at the square footage of the building. It's a fairly simple analysis to say that for this size building with this type of use, it's going to generate this many PM peak vehicle trips. And then we run it through this model. And if that new development pushes that PM peak hour beyond our adopted level of service of E to F, then what the jurisdiction needs to do is we need to either deny the development or we need to tell them to mitigate. And the way they generally would mitigate, they would either widen the street or they would improve an intersection. Or more likely what would happen is they wouldn't build there because the mitigation would be too costly. So it drives development to the edges of the town, or maybe out into the county or a smaller town, where they don't have as much vehicle, they don't have as much traffic, and they don't have to mitigate, and they can build. But what ends up happening is you have a way of measurement of your level of service that looks only at vehicles. It's not looking at any other way we move people around. It's only looking at the automobile. Then what's going to happen is we're going to push people out to the suburbs. We're going to push people out to the small cities. But those people are still going to need to come into the city center, to the City of Bellingham, because we're the regional employment center, regional retail center. What ends up happening is we get in a vicious cycle of widening our arterials, widening our highways to accommodate the vehicles. And remember that our growth management goals, our land use goals, were to accommodate infill development, more compact development. The way we measured historically the level of service for vehicles and for transportation network was having the opposite effect. So we needed a new way to measure. We needed a new system. Back in 2006, we were recognizing that. We were saying we want to have development in the urban villages, but we were running into this problem. We had adopted a level of service E citywide. We even said we'll allow a level of service F on our most heavily used arterials and within the urban villages, and we said, a certain amount of congestion in the urban core, that's okay for a city. We should expect that. As we get denser, we're going to have some challenges getting around. But you can see some of the comments from the community at the time. It was different to people. People weren't used to that. They wanted us to try to build our way out of it, widen the arterials, widen the intersections. There were even people that came to the council meetings and planning commission meetings with shirts that said failure or planning for failure is failure to plan. So planning for F and saying F is okay is a problem. That's what they were saying. We obviously needed a new way. And what we needed was a way to measure our transportation network that took into consideration all of the built environment. So all of the bicycle facilities that we have, bicycle lanes, multi-use trails like the greenway system, the sidewalks that are in place, and the fact that we have a great transit system here. WTA provides a very high level of service within the urban core, yet we weren't acknowledging that when we were looking at how we measure how effective our transportation system is. But as I said, GMA says you need to figure out how to measure it. We had this vehicle over capacity measurement, but we needed a way to measure how effective and how much capacity we had when we add in these other modes of transportation. So our transportation planners, we hired an outside consulting firm, and we worked with them and said, how do we take advantage of that? How do we measure it in a way that we can measure year over year and we can change as we improve the transportation network? So we came up with a model where we look at the bicycle, the pedestrian, some of our greenways trails, not all of them, but the ones that are used for connections, for commuting, and obviously transit. Still measuring vehicles, but it's only one of 5 measurements now, rather than the only measurement that we used before. And the way we came up with the measurement was we identified networks. We said we have a complete bicycle network. It's not all built yet, but we know what we want to have built. That's going to allow people to move throughout the neighborhoods using a bicycle safely. Same thing with walking on the sidewalks. So we identified a network, and then we started looking at how complete is that network within any given area, and we developed some concurrency service areas. So we're not looking at the whole city at a time. We're looking at different areas that have the same network and comparison so that we can look individually at the impacts. Even though transportation is citywide, there's also impacts directly to the neighborhood. So we broke the city down into concurrency service areas. And what this is the one on the left here. That's how we look at our pedestrian network. You can see the city's broken down into these concurrency service areas. That's what these little lines are. And ultimately what happened were the areas in the city center, like downtown and Old Town and the areas where we had a built environment. Obviously, the percentage of the networks, the pedestrian networks in the built environment was much, much higher. And we came up with a way to assign, rather than vehicle trip capacity, person trip capacity. We changed the whole model so that when someone came in to develop, they needed to calculate how many person trips did they need, recognizing that if people built where we wanted them to build in the urban center, that there would be more people using the sidewalks and the built bicycle facilities and not just driving. So what ended up happening is now, under the new multimodal concurrency system, the areas that have the most person trips available are the areas we want people to develop, which is in the urban core. We recognize that that comes also with some vehicle congestion on our highly used arterials, but again, we need to become accustomed to that and recognize that that's going to happen. We're not going to widen arterials and improve intersections because we have delay for a half hour or an hour or 15 minutes in the peak hour. We'll go back to that graph. We have all that unused capacity for 23 hours out of the day. We don't need to build any more arterials. So the next thing we did, I talked about the incentives, that was our next implementation strategy. The puzzle pieces on the right here, those are kind of the 4 different ways that developments pay for, private development pays for infrastructure that they need to accommodate their development. I talked about the upper left, concurrency. The impact analysis is an engineering study that just says exactly what the impact of the development will be. I want to talk a little bit about transportation impact fees. In Washington State, we can charge impact fees for development. The idea of it is that every development does have an impact on the city. We charge park impact fees to developers to help pay for parks that are going to be needed to accommodate the growth from their development. The school district charges school impact fees, and we charge transportation impact fees or traffic impact fees in public works. And we calculate that by coming up with, we look back 6 years and see how much money we spent on the transportation network over the previous 6 years. And we look forward 6 years. We had to come up with some time frame to look at. So we're looking at a 12-year rolling average of how much money the city's spending, how much dollars are going into transportation improvement, sidewalks, bike lanes, things of that nature. And we can come up with a proportionate share for new development, assigning to how many person trips they generate with their development. And the developer has to pay those impact fees at the time of development. And it can be a significant cost to a developer. And we were looking at ways to try to incentivize development in the urban core, recognizing that it can be, it's not always, but it can be more expensive to build a building downtown than perhaps in a greenfield development on the edge of town. It's tighter, there's more traffic to deal with. The right-of-way has more things in it, there's more utilities, there's less room to store your construction equipment. There's challenges associated with it. And it's new for a lot of developers too. They're not comfortable doing it. So again, we're trying to incentivize it. But we also know that if you build, let's say you build a residential unit downtown Bellingham. You've built it in the urban core, you've got sidewalk, you have bike lane, but you also have services and amenities nearby. And it's reasonable to think that if you're living downtown, you're not going to drive your car everywhere you go. You're going to walk, you're going to take your bike, you're going to walk to the store, you're going to take your bike to the appointments that you have, assuming that it's nearby. So you are creating less impact on the transportation network, especially as it relates to vehicles. So we give a reduction to people that develop within those identified urban villages, up to 50%. It can be a significant amount. Developers have saved about $500,000 by building on impact fees since we implemented this program by building in the urban core. We provide some other tax incentives, multifamily tax incentives and things of that nature, and reduce some of the development fees. Over time, we need to look at that because when we give incentives, we're not receiving the revenue. It doesn't go into our budget and help us as we need to replace and repair the infrastructure. So there's a downside to that. And we need to look to see just how much we need to incentivize this type of development over time. People are going to want, hopefully, to develop here, and we need to reconsider whether we need to provide the incentives. But these are in place at this time. And here's an example of how this can work. This is an aerial photo of an area in Fairhaven, right here. Finnegan, 12th, Mill Street, right here. Fairhaven Library, right there, to get you oriented. A couple vacant lots right there in Fairhaven. Pretty dense development down there already. It's been a successful urban village. We've had quite a bit of development over the years there. And one of the things we've been able to do with the new multimodal concurrency model is when development comes in and they have to pay, they either have to give us mitigation fees or impact fees. Those fees don't have to go to street improvements that are just for vehicles. We can go out and complete missing sidewalk gaps, improve the pedestrian environment. And here's an example of that. Development's going in right here. We've got an urban village plan for Fairhaven that says we'd like to have wider sidewalks there, areas for people to gather, gathering places. So we work with the developer, and up here you can see this partnership where the developer is paying for some of the improvements. The city's using some grants to do that. But more importantly, what we're doing is we're building infrastructure that's going to really accommodate all of the modes, bike, pedestrian, and not just going out and improving intersections for vehicles. And it's a way to coordinate our funding with private developers' funding and make these type of developments work and hopefully be successful over time. So the third thing we're looking at from an implementation perspective is we really do need to look at the transportation network, as a complete network, providing bits and pieces of sidewalk and bits and pieces of bike lane aren't really that effective at getting people throughout the town to where we want them to go. We want people to get to their destinations. We want them to be able to ride from where they live to where they work and where they shop, to walk in those areas. We want to make sure that transit can get around town and stay on time. And so we've really taken the tact of we're looking at a complete network Some of you may have heard, and something that we talk about a lot in the planning and transportation arena is complete streets, making sure that every street we build, not every street, but where appropriate, we put in bike facilities and pedestrian facilities. And Bellingham's been doing that for a long time. For the last 12 years, we haven't built a project that hasn't had a bike and pedestrian component to it. We're not out just building transportation projects serving vehicles. But we really need to make sure that we're getting that connectivity that we want. And when we design our projects, we've adopted this model, which a lot of jurisdictions have, that if we're doing a corridor project or an intersection project, we want to look at all of the modes. And we want to use this hierarchy to give the biggest priority when it comes to safety and convenience to the most vulnerable modes. So we want to consider the pedestrian and cyclists first when we do a project. We need to consider safety for all of the modes, but we want to make sure that we are really focusing on pedestrian and cycling connectivity. I know you can't read this map, but it's simply an illustration of a process that the City of Bellingham went through. Back in 2012, the city adopted its first pedestrian master plan. And as part of that process, we had a big public process, went out and talked to the neighborhoods, had public hearings, used some online surveys to identify where people are trying to go on their bike, where the barriers are, where people are having a hard time moving throughout the city. We used some GIS analysis looking at our denser populations and inserting the areas that we know people need to go to, schools, commercial centers, anywhere that we know people need to be able to get to the highest number of people. We identified a primary pedestrian master plan, or primary pedestrian network, that looked at the missing links and we ranked those. We said if we connect a sidewalk here, we're going to get the most in terms of connectivity and opening up the most area and the most services to the broadest number of people. But this pedestrian master plan's identified several hundred miles of sidewalk that we need to build still. We've got several hundred miles now, but we've got a long ways to go. Not every street's going to have a sidewalk because it's very, very expensive to build them. But we've identified the areas where we need to build them because without the sidewalks, people can't get safely around town and where they want to be. We did the same thing with the bicycle master plan that we adopted in 2014, and that looked at exactly the same thing. How do we get people across I-5? We know that people that live on the east side of I-5 have a hard time getting downtown because there's not adequate ways to get under or over I-5. And right now we're looking at Lakeway. We recognize if you live in the Puget neighborhood or over in Sudden Valley outside the city or in Whatcom Falls, it's very difficult to ride to the university or ride downtown because there's not a real safe way, convenient way to get across the interstate. Those are the type of things that were identified throughout the planning process. And we identified them as priorities. And now not only can the city look at those, try to plan for constructing those types of facilities, but we can also leverage money from private developers to try to build those types of facilities. Transit is another key component. We work very closely with WTA, who's also going through a planning update right now. They're looking at their strategic plan. We have staff that have been involved with that process from the very beginning. And we have a commitment to WTA to make sure that we work with them to keep them on time. We want to make sure that they're able to meet their stops on time. We understand that people that use transit by choice, transit needs to be available, it needs to be on time. People have a lot of options around here. One of the things we don't have in Bellingham are some of the constraints that the much larger metropolitan areas do. It's still pretty easy to drive from the small cities in the county into downtown, find parking. It's relatively cheap. There's not a lot of congestion. So when we look at people trying to move people to transit, it's not going to be faster to take transit like it would be if you lived in Bothell down in the Puget Sound area and you're trying to get to the downtown UW campus. It's faster to take transit because we have transit dedicated facilities down there and you're out of the congestion. So there's an advantage in speed. It's cheaper because you don't have to pay for parking when you get to downtown Seattle. That could cost you $20, $30 a day. We don't have those constraints here. It's a good thing. We don't have to deal with all that congestion, but we also don't have the motivators to get people to take transit. So we recognize if we want to take people to take transit, it better be on time and it better be able to get people where they want to go when they want to go there. So this is a map of the primary transit network, and we work very closely with them. And the final strategy is the education and encouragement, and it's very important. We can build infrastructure, we can improve the network, but people need to be aware of the choices that are available to them, and we need to work with our larger employers in town and make sure they understand the transit options that are available to them. make sure that they understand the easy routes to ride their bike to work, and work with employers and encourage them to build bike rooms in their facilities and provide bus passes to their employers. So these are a couple of examples. We work closely with Susan's group over at the Council of Governments, and they have a Smart Trips program that helps people track their trips and become much more aware about how they get around town and make the right choices on how they can do it. Obviously, there's an environmental benefit and reduced emissions that helps us meet some of our carbon goals. That's a great thing. It also provides additional capacity by carpooling, by taking transit, by taking other ways of getting around town. Work with the schools, teaching middle school students how to ride the bus. I mean, it increases their mobility. It opens up a lot of options to them, help them get around town and get from one place to another on transit and start some good habits earlier. And we work very closely with the Bellingham School District. One of the challenges is we've got an environment now at the elementary schools where a lot of the students aren't riding buses, their parents are driving them to school. It's become much more common. The schools aren't set up for that. The transportation system gets overwhelmed with drop off and pick up. We want to teach people, we want to encourage people to ride the school bus. We want to make sure that kids know there's safe routes to school, and if there aren't safe routes to school, we want to go out and build the sidewalks and the bike lanes to get the kids to the elementary schools. Again, it increases their mobility and teaches them other ways to get around town. So how is all this working? We've been doing this for about 10 years now. So what's been the result? So this map shows development in the urban villages, and when we look at all of the housing units that have come online that have been built since 2006, 45% of them have come into the urban villages. So we are getting growth in the urban villages. We're building residential downtown, Barclay, residential in Fairhaven. So there's been some success in getting folks to live in these urban villages where we'd like to see them go. In transportation, we talk a lot about mode shift, and it's one of the primary goals in the comprehensive plan. We want to, over time, provide networks for pedestrians and bicycles and all the other modes we've talked about, so that ultimately people will make choices when they commute to work other than single occupancy vehicle. We've got a lot of benefits by doing that, obviously not just a transportation capacity perspective, but as I mentioned, our carbon reductions, we know that emissions, we know that transportation is one of the largest segments of our carbon footprint issues and emissions. We want to, by 2036, get down to where only 50% of the people, still a lot of cars on the road. We recognize we're not going to get away from that in the near term, but can we make some positive gains? And we have. If you can see that over time, maybe not as quickly as we would like, but we are increasing the other modes, and we're seeing a slight reduction in the number of people that are driving to work. But Susan asked me to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and I think it's challenges to helping us meet our goals faster and perhaps going even further. And there's some realities, I call them challenges and realities to Bellingham when we look at transportation. We are clearly the regional center, meaning that a lot of people work in Bellingham, shop in Bellingham, but don't live in Bellingham. So we have to recognize that, this is on every day, about 28,000 people that live outside the city of Bellingham drive into Bellingham for work or need to commute into Bellingham. Hopefully not just drive, hopefully taking transit. We also have to recognize we need to get freight in and out, goods in and out. So as much as we want to focus on internal circulation, working on the urban villages and non-motorized types of connections, we do need to recognize that our commerce relies on us being this retail center. And that's no different than any metropolitan area within a county. We definitely experience a lot of traffic from outside the city. What does make us a little bit different than most jurisdictions is the Canadian influence. And I think it's something that we all see when we're out around town. You see the Canadian license plates. I think everyone's aware of it, but perhaps not fully aware of the magnitude of the influence. When we look at the lower BC, what this map is, this is a flow map, a trip distribution map. The thickness of the line represents the volume. So not much volume, not as much volume up here. Here's the border. This is I-5 coming in from lower BC. This is the guide meridian. Lower BC, it's much, much bigger than the city of Seattle, and we don't always recognize that. The number of people that are just across the border has a much more significant impact on us than the Puget Sound region does. We're one of the largest ports in the country. meaning that the number of trips that come across the border, I think we're third in the country in terms of total trips that come across. And our economy is largely dependent on the lower BC. That was a real benefit to us during the recession when the Canadian economy wasn't experiencing quite the downturn at the same time. Now we're seeing some things happen with the Canadian dollar, obviously, but it did help us through that recession. But there is a reality to the fact that the people that are coming down from Vancouver and from lower BC, most of them are driving down. And a lot of our businesses depend on the Canadian economy coming down. So we do have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of commerce. We have to be aware of freight. We have to be aware of the people that are coming in from outside of our region. It means we can't totally ignore our interchanges. We can't totally ignore our arterials. We can focus on other things, but we can't ignore these, which means we have to put some of our resources and some of our time into dealing with some of these issues that may not be totally apparent. The other challenge with the Canadian influence from a transportation perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about funding here in a couple slides, is in Washington, a large amount of our transportation funding comes from fuel tax. If you've ever been to a gas station up on the Guide Meridian or in that area, you always see Canadians there and they're filling up their gas tanks, and fuel's so much cheaper here than it is in Canada. But the way a gas tax works is it's collected locally and it's all sent down to Olympia, and then it's distributed back to the cities based on population. So it doesn't matter how much fuel you sell within your jurisdiction, the fuel tax you get is based on how many people live in your city. And Whatcom County, for many, many years, has been the largest exporter of fuel tax in the state. We sell more gas here than any other county per capita because of the Canadian influence, but we don't get that revenue back to help us deal with some of the impacts. So it's a bit of a challenge, but there's an awful lot of benefits too from the Canadian influence. So when we talk about funding, and these are some of the points that when I listened to Charles this morning that I really thought he was right on the mark. I mean, obviously funding is a big challenge, and the way we've developed historically is not financially sustainable. And he did an excellent job of pointing that out. And I enjoyed listening to the way he explained it, because I think it'll be helpful for us as we try to explain it in the future. But the realities of our funding, I talked about the fuel tax. It's an outdated model. It doesn't make a lot of sense. We don't want people to drive. We're trying to decrease the vehicle miles traveled. Our entire system for replacing our streets, replacing our sidewalks is largely based on fuel. So we need to look at that over time. It's a statewide initiative. We can do some things locally, but we can't change that right now. But it is a reality. It's one of the challenges. As Charles mentioned, we rely on state and federal grants. It's the way we get things done. It's a problem from a local perspective, as he clearly pointed out, and that there's no cost to the city, or relatively little cost to the city, when we use federal and state grants up front when we construct something, but it's ours forever to maintain. And the cost of maintenance is where we fall short. And there are no grants for maintenance. Maintenance is always borne by the local jurisdiction. We've done a few things to help us a little bit. We adopted a transportation benefit district. The voters approved that. It's a 0.2% sales tax. It was one reason for that was to capture some of that Canadian influence. When they come down, they shop, they pay sales tax. It's a way for us to benefit from that. Sales tax has its challenges, as you know, as a taxing method. But it's one of the things that we've done. But it expires in 2020. It brings in about $5 million a year. We rely heavily on it for building those sidewalks, maintaining our streets, repaving. It expires in 2020. And when that expires, by that time, there'll be a whole slew of voter initiatives that will be have gone in front of the voters prior to that. A couple council members here, and they know very well what they are. We're going to ask the voters to vote on an EMS levy to fund Medic One, vote on Greenways levy to continue to pay for our Greenways trails, which is one of the reasons people love to live here. It's one of the real benefits of Bellingham, the great park system, but we need to pay for that. There's going to be school district levies. All these levies we're going to ask the voters to approve, so I have some real concerns about whether or not when the transportation benefit district comes due in 2020, we're going to be able to get that support, because we'll have been asking an awful lot of the voters. So that's one of our challenges. Another challenge is housing, and we are going through the comprehensive plan update right now, and one of the biggest things we talk about, housing forms, we talk about land supply, but we also talk about infill development and neighborhood character. There's some realities of trying to deal with neighborhoods. We know we want to see infill. We know we want to see things like accessory dwelling units. But what we hear from some of the public is that's not what they want to see. So it's an education thing. It's going to take some time, but it is one of the challenges to meeting some of our goals of infill. And it's a reality. It's not something we can't get past, but we recognize that it is a challenge. Housing affordability, trying to keep housing relatively reasonable and competitive in the city, and not having people go out further into the county, into the small cities where we just experience more of that congestion and some of the challenges that we're trying to avoid. But with all of that, I think we're making some pretty good progress. There's a lot more to do. There's no doubt about that, and there's a lot ahead of us. But I mentioned the 45% of units that are being built in the urban villages. We've seen some mode shift. We would certainly like to see more. We want that to go further and a little bit quicker. But since 2010, our biggest focus has been on completing our non-motorized infrastructure. And we've done quite a bit by using that local money from the Transportation Benefit District, but leveraging developer money that we couldn't have done previously. We built 39 bicycle projects and over 50 projects supporting pedestrians just in the last few years. So we are making progress. There's a lot more to do. And this has just been kind of some of the strategies that we've been working on, trying to implement some of the principles that Charles talked about in his talk. But there's a lot more to do. I just touched on the surface of it, but I wanted to provide some time for you guys to ask questions if you had any of what we're doing. I have some colleagues here that can help me out if you ask something that I can't answer, but be happy to answer questions for a little bit. Okay, thank you.